Good morning and welcome to this week's Pastor's Chat. I'm Randy Sherrill, the teaching pastor here at Fletcher United Methodist Church. First of all, an announcement. We will be having virtual communion in our worship service this coming Sunday. So I encourage you to get your elements ready, and we will have the prayer that you can participate in, and I will lead us through the time when we receive. So thank you for your preparation for that. Second, I just wanted to talk about some of the dynamics that we are dealing with in the nation, world, and everywhere. First of all, we are continuing to fight or run from an unseen, at least to the human eye, disaster that continues to happen with the coronavirus. And we continue to pray that we will be wise and safe. That's why we're not back into in-person worship yet, but also that our scientists who are working as hard as they can will find ways as soon as possible to help protect us from this. But again, this is something that we'll deal with for the rest of human history because these things keep adapting. We're also dealing prominently with a seen and sometimes subtle and insidious situation of prejudice and injustice and racism. I thought about jumping on from last week's Pastor's Chat that another memory I have of my growing up is my grandparents Cheryl's, where they lived and their garden area. And at least myself and my cousins believe that the primary crop that Grandpa and Grandma Cheryl grew were rocks, because every time that the ground was turned or disc plowed, another huge crop of rocks would show up. And so if you ever went to visit them as a grandchild, you got to spend at least a few hours out in the field taking those rocks to the edge of the field so that they could raise something. It also was filled oftentimes with lots of Native American artifacts that we collected. And that reminded me of every time that we think that we've gotten beyond, we have not. And so now it is very obvious, and hopefully we've reached the point that we can turn the corner and be honest and truthful with one another, and to really value one another as God's children and God's creation. Some of the memories I have growing up was seeing the late school bus a couple hours after I got home that would be delivering the black kids, the African American kids, to the one Rosenwald school for each level of schooling in the whole county. But I also remember good memories of times of need when my next door uncle died unexpectedly on that hog killing day, and the whole community coming together. And as our community worked together to start our local fire department, it was not restricted to anybody, whoever wanted to help. And I remember people working side by side. 1968, I was 12 years old. And it was one of the toughest times in my life because I was in formation of my own identity. My next brother was 8 years ahead of me and was a political science major at the University of North Carolina. And we had some very tough discussions around the meal tables when he was there about the injustices, about poll tax, about all the different discriminations that were still at work in the late 60s even. It was also rough because I was already politically involved at that time, and I remember that two of the most important people that I looked up to were assassinated that year. First of all, in April of that year, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and then in June, Bobby Kennedy, as he was running for president. And I can remember the darkness and the heaviness about such great leaders that were taken from us. I also decided to do work in high school and in college on Dr. King. And as I've told you before, that wonderful class, the first class at seminary at Emory, on the theology of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that Dr. Erskine was the primary professor, and we had Andrew Young, we had Coretta Scott King, we had Daddy King, we had Dr. James Cone, and other family members, and we visited all the historic sites, and that was such a life-changing experience. But I also remember that Dr. King, there were two people that he drew primarily his guidance from in his nonviolent work that ultimately cost his life for justice, for peace, for equality. The first one, obviously, was Jesus Christ, is that he was a pastor, a local church pastor first. And he was preaching about these things before he was called on by the community to help lead us. So he followed Jesus. But the second one was, and I did a major thesis on this in college, was Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi was before Dr. King, and he started his work of fighting against, in a nonviolent way, against British imperialism in India. And he took on the mantle of leadership in a very simple way. He was a vegetarian, he lived off the land, and he led numerous nonviolent journeys. The most famous one was the Salt Road work against the British imperialists that he would lead, and they walked for 24 straight days on the Salt Road against all the taxes and different things. 10 miles a day. He fasted very much. And Dr. King was reinvigorated to make sure that all of his work and all that he was associated with would be nonviolent. And in 1948, as the British Empire in that area was coming apart, and unfortunately that landmass was divided. Primarily Hindu became India, primarily Muslim became Pakistan. And a Muslim assassinated Mahatma Gandhi because he was working again to try to bring these two groups of people who at times had deep hatred and prejudice against one another. He was trying to bring them together. And at least one man rose up and made sure that he could not continue his work. So let's continue our work as people of faith following Jesus, as people of high ethical standards, of truly understanding, as John Lewis said in his speech to the students at Troy University. No matter who we are, we have to be able to live together, because finally we are one family and we live on one earth together. I pray for us as a community, as a world, and as a church. Have a blessed week.